When my wife and I sit down to watch a horror movie, we have two very different approaches. I tend to think about how I could defeat the monster. That could come in handy in real life. I also like to think that maybe that makes me a realist. My wife thinks I'm an optimist when it comes to defeating fake threats. But she spends that time trying not to get too attached to the characters, and I know this because she's a vocal movie watcher. For every character that wanders off alone, she announces with confidence and certainty that they're done for. They shouldn't have left the group, the monster can see them, and they're never coming out of the garage. I think she does this so she's not surprised if they get a little bit murdered. But the funny thing is, she thinks she's a realist too. But that's the point of a movie, to be on the edge of your seat. That uncertainty makes for a more entertaining story. And though I feel I could defeat some of those villains, I prefer a little less excitement in real life. Unfortunately, we got our scare in a different way. My wife suffers from cystic fibrosis. And more scary than any horror movie was watching her suffer through heart failure, respiratory failure, and then 6 months on a ventilator. When that became my reality, I struggled to find a way to stay realistic, but also have a sense of optimism. And I learned that that perspective of realistic optimism had even more value when the struggle lasted month after month after month. Now, Rebecca had always suffered from CF, and we'd expected that at some point she would have a decline and require a lung transplant. But when that decline started, it still took us off guard. She was working from her hospital room just a few hours before she went into respiratory failure. It was New Year's Eve when she was placed on a ventilator in a chemically induced coma. As the days passed, her odds for survival began to decrease. And as the weeks passed, I witnessed one scare after another. And I remember how I felt when they told me she probably wouldn't survive. I did not feel optimistic. Because to me, optimistic people just knew things would be fine. They had this blind faith that everything would work out, but I wasn't so sure. And I'd much rather hear a harsh reality than get a watered-down version of the truth. So when the doctors gave me the opportunity to participate in morning rounds, I took them up on it. I wanted to learn as much as possible because even though I wasn't an expert, I wanted to help figure out how we were going to defeat this monster. Rebecca's condition stayed borderline for months. And I'd update friends and family every day. They started to call me optimistic. And I knew it wasn't blind optimism, so I recognized it as something else, realistic optimism. I wasn't telling them that everything would be fine, but I was telling them what our path to success looked like. I didn't cherry pick the positive, but I did try to see a silver lining through all the negative. And there were a lot of bad updates. First, she was placed on a ventilator. Then she aspirated into her airways, meaning her stomach contents got into her lungs. That caused another pneumonia. They told me she wouldn't survive without a lung transplant. Then they said that she was too sick to qualify for one. But there was some good news mixed in with the bad. When she cultured a bad bacteria, it would later clear. When her kidney numbers came back worse one day, another day they might come back better. And when she required more support from the ventilator one week, the next week she might require less. There were definitely weeks where the bad news outweighed the good, but I saw no reason not to celebrate the good. I didn't consider myself blindly optimistic, but I thought the positive was at least as important to share as the negative. In February, Rebecca woke from the coma. Our first conversation didn't go as expected because she was still on the ventilator. It connected through a trach placed below her vocal cord, so she literally had no voice. But I could learn to read lips, and I soon found out that we had bigger problems. She had experienced severe muscle atrophy from weeks of immobility and could only lift her hand a few shaky inches off the bed. She couldn't even reach up and scratch her own cheek. We knew she needed to get stronger to be a good transplant candidate. She needed to be stronger not only to survive a transplant, but simply be considered for evaluation. Excuse me. And at the time, she was vulnerable, dependent on a ventilator for every breath. She had diabetes that could turn life-threatening like that. And she also had no voice to call for help in an emergency. So our first strength goal was simple and functional. Be able to press the call button in an emergency. When she can do that, it became to stand and then walk further. Walking wasn't just exercise, it was a demonstration of that strength. And we wanted to show the hospitals that she was driven and that she could survive. At this point, it was unlikely still that they would list somebody as sick as Rebecca, but it was possible. We were realistically optimistic. We needed to be. And we learned that you could have a good day in the hospital. It wasn't all about the living you were going to do later. It was about the living we were doing right then and there. We could listen to music. I could bring in her cat, Paul, for a visit. We could get takeout as an alternative to hospital food. One thing I learned was that Rebecca liked alternatives to hospital food. And at a time when her condition was borderline, we recognized we had a choice. We could either begin grieving early or make the best of these days. And what I learned was that these days between prognosis and conclusion, whatever that might be, they had value. Staying motivated was still a challenge. And what 15 years leading projects had taught me was that sometimes short-term successes could provide a little motivation. It wasn't usually about some big surprise victory. It was about chipping away at a goal, short-term successes. And it was tempting just to step back and be overwhelmed by the mountain in front of us. Henry Ford once said, "Obstacles are those frightful things you see when you take your eyes off your goal." But what do you focus on when your goal is so far away? Well, back at work and in the hospital, there were many steps between where we were and where we wanted to be. And if we could recognize each of those steps for what they were, successes, then the journey itself could provide a little motivation to keep us going. When Rebecca woke from the coma and we had that first conversation, that was a victory. When she became strong enough to pick things from her bedside table, that was a victory. And when UPMC Transplant Program agreed to evaluate her after 5 consecutive hospitals declined to, that was a victory. I have to admit, though, in the beginning, I was celebrating many of these milestones alone. When she had gone into the coma, she could walk, talk, and breathe on her own. Now she could do none of that. I remember one night when I told her I was proud of her. And she said, "I believe you're proud of me, but I'm not proud of myself." She'd always been an overachiever, but she was comparing herself to an impossible standard. But that was her opinion, and I couldn't change that directly. The best I could do was make a case for her accomplishments. Now, full disclosure, my track record at convincing my wife of things is mediocre at best. But I knew one thing, and I used it. My wife is a science nerd. So I learned to include a fact with every compliment. It was great that she'd completed 2 more exercise sessions than the prior week, walked 10 feet further than a few days ago, or done 15 more reps than yesterday. I hoped that she would start to build a new baseline, a new measure for success. And then one night, I told her I was proud of her, and she said, "I'm proud too." That mindset was critical at a time when her drive to survive meant everything. At this point, we didn't know if she would get listed. But we were optimistic. We still hit some hurdles, though. After waking from the coma, building up her strength, and transferring to Pittsburgh for evaluation, Rebecca crashed. Her heart rate dropped to 41 beats a minute. Her blood pressure dropped to 57/30. And her oxygen level dropped to 29%. She almost died waiting to be listed. The staff reacted quickly, though. They put her on something called ECMO. Now, this machine continuously pumped blood from a vein in her neck through a device that added oxygen and removed carbon dioxide before returning it to her. Now, these tubes couldn't kink or pull out without detrimental effect. So she wore a headband to keep one in place, and the other was stitched up her right leg. As a result, she could only move a few degrees in any direction, and I couldn't imagine how horrible this was for her. To top it off, they told us it was unlikely she'd survive more than 2 weeks without a transplant, and she wasn't even listed. It was more than just discouraging, it was terrifying. And I'd read many things from her lips over the previous months, but I'll never forget what I read after she was placed on ECMO. "I'm in hell," she told me. She had this look of desperation in her eyes when she said, "I'm done. I want to die." She was done fighting, done working so hard toward a goal that would never be realized. This was what it looked like when all hope was gone. But all hope wasn't gone. That's the thing about the future. We don't know what it'll bring, even though we spend our entire lives trying to predict it. She could be listed at any point, and I told her this, but she'd heard it before. I tried to paint this vision of us sitting on the couch watching a movie post-transplant, but she wasn't buying it. And when we finished that conversation, she just stared off. There was no conclusion, no optimism, and an unknowable future. Then my phone rang. In one conversation, our entire trajectory changed. Rebecca was listed. Now, it was the next short-term success and no guarantee of anything, but it meant everything. She was so sick that she was in the #1 position on that list. And as I told her, I watched the despair fade and the hope return to her eyes. In just a few hours, we had gone from the lowest low to an incredible high. But even then, we had a choice. We could choose to be upset that she had declined so far, or we could choose to be happy that she had a chance at transplant. But if we had a choice, why not be optimistic? Rebecca faced those next weeks with a drive and determination that I had never seen from anyone. She had this look in her eye, a resolve. At this point, there was no delusion about our current condition. There was simply a realistic optimism. And as I look back, it's more clear than ever. Rebecca is the strongest person I know. On June 18th, 2015, Rebecca received a double lung transplant that saved her life. Thanks to great care she'd received in Cincinnati, a hospital in Pittsburgh that took a chance on her, a donor and their selfless family, Rebecca's 2.5 years post-transplant and breathing strong. But even now, though, worry creeps in. The average life expectancy at 5 years post-transplant is not much better than 50%. So, yet again, we're living in those days between prognosis and conclusion. But if we can have a good day in the hospital, we can certainly have a good day outside of it. And who's to say what the future will bring? I've become no better at predicting it. And now we can face that future sitting on a couch and watching a movie. Rebecca still thinks the worst for those poor supporting characters in the horror movies. But their stories are already written. And as pessimistic as you want to be, you'll only think the worst for about 2 hours while you watch that movie. In reality, you could think the worst for 3 days, or 4 months, or 5 years. So if those days between prognosis and conclusion can be good days, then they have value. And if those days in between matter, then optimism can cause a real effect. And just maybe, choosing realistic optimism can drive a better result than you ever thought possible. And if that's true, I'll ask, why not be optimistic?